we have had much human wrong, much human folly, a lot of things that one might wish to avenge, but we have a lot of philosophy to study, to gain wisdom from. Because if we can get past today's trials, I think we can bequeath some lessons that will make for a better America in the future. I don't know if you've ever watched The Godfather.
Many times, yeah.
Okay. The very first opening scene where the Undertaker comes to see the Don, and the opening words of the film are the Undertaker's "I believe in America."
Yeah.
Now in the movie, there's a context because they're going to now test the man's faith and expose it as somewhat, lacking. But I think we can take it verbatim. I believe in America, and I think that's a belief we all need to. Whatever other changes and beliefs come, that's a belief we need to uphold.
Yeah, and you and I are in such agreement on that. And one of the things that distresses me sometimes about the direction that what you might call left-wing or liberal America is taking is this kind of whole cloth inability to separate the things that have given us the ability to protest, imperfect freedoms, incompleted agendas, racism, and all the rest of it. And all of a sudden, the vision of America that some of my left-wing friends to the left of me seem to have is one that has morally surpassed the America founded in the Enlightenment and the ideas of not just our founding documents, but philosophically, the inconvenient dominance of the white male in our history, and this kind of vision of an America that has to move past this. And one hopes that it doesn't include moving past these truths of the kind that you just expressed in reading this, very luminous quote from Lincoln. And so one question I have for you in terms of your journey out of what I wouldn't call it the right wing, but the W. Bush years. By the way, a man who sent my Marine son into combat several times in Afghanistan and then in Iraq, who came back fortunately in one piece and is now married with 3 of my youngest grandchildren living across the street. So happy ending.
Congratulations.
But, my sense is that you would be someone who, like me, because I won't say we're on the other side politically than you're from now, but you've been on a journey. So I would like you to describe that journey in terms of spirituality, ideology, belief, temperament, and kind of snapshot, because you're aware of that journey, of where you are today on this whole range of issues of who we are as Americans and just, the rising kind of boiling anger against the former establishment, of which I guess I'm a member because I'm 71 and I'm white and I'm the age I am. And then on the other hand, this desire to hand off a better future to younger people who often seem a bit naive to me.
Well, it's a question into which my authorial jaws will happily sink. I've been working for the past couple of years and will be working for some time longer on a political memoir, not an autobiography because my personal life isn't so interesting, but where I started and where I ended up. I was born in Canada in 1960, in the last year of the Eisenhower administration. I grew up in Canada. I grew up in great. This is why I can't write an autobiography, because you're supposed to write about trials and traumas overcome. And I grew up actually in a very comfortable home, very happy. My parents were both prominent and successful people who loved each other, loved us. Close. I grew up. I have a sister I'm very close to, and so no complaints. But I grew up under the great arching security umbrella of the United States. And I became aware at a young age that it had not always been so, because although my parents' lives were very comfortable and secure, their parents' lives had been anything but. In fact, the great majority of my father's family were murdered in Europe. By happenstance, his parents came to Canada in 1930, not for any prophetic reason. They couldn't find work in Poland. And they came to Canada and settled and didn't really prosper, but found stability. But had they made a different decision, they would have been murdered in probably the year 1941, 2 or 3, and my father would have been murdered at age 10, 11, 12, 13. I would never have been born. So that was always overhanging, that knowledge. And the Toronto in which I grew up was a very cosmopolitan and developing city, but again, it owed everything to this great protection it didn't provide for itself. And so my foundational political idea was the value of what the United States gave not only to its own people, but to all free people everywhere. And as a Canadian, this was an intensely real thing to me. We didn't pay for our security. The Americans paid for it, and we enjoyed it. And the same was true for people on the continent of Europe and people in Japan and Taiwan and South Korea. They paid some. Canadians are big free riders, so they pay more. But again, it was the United States that guaranteed all of this. I became then came the troubles of the 1970s, and I became very fascinated with the problems of inflation and crime and social disorder. And I came to a conservative political philosophy, and that was pretty fully formed by the 1980s, the Reagan era. And it all seemed vindicated. My wife and I married, and we met in 1987 and married in 1988. We took a long kind of honeymoon trip together through newly decommunized Eastern Europe in the spring of 1990. And we thought we had lived to see the vindication of everything we believed in, this massive eruption of freedom, first in Central Europe, but then in other places. Then democracy came to South Korea, to Taiwan, and Mexico opened up to multi-party democracy, and the Pinochet dictatorship went out of business in Chile, and the Philippines returned to democracy, and South Africa ended apartheid, and just not that you're ever trouble-free, but the ideals of a free society and a free economy and it's from 1988 to 1995, it just seemed all to be going forward. I joined the W. Bush administration. Speechwriters are typically young people. I was not. I had just turned 40 before I went to work in the Bush administration. I was quite a formed person. And so one of my personal private pet peeves is people always say, George Bush said this or that at some point in his career, you must think this. I said, look, I went to George W. Bush's White House to help him, not because he was going to form me intellectually, but to help him be the president he wanted to be. And my job was to help him be the best and most eloquent and most effective spokesman for his point of view. I never had any of those West Wing moments where I walk into the president's office and say, you think this, but I think that. That wasn't my job. I had written 2 books by the time I got to the Bush White House. I would write more. When I came out of the Bush White House, I was a strong supporter of his foreign policy, especially. I was a supporter of the War on Terror, of his actions against Saddam Hussein and other actions. And my politics began to wander a little bit after that, and especially during the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. Now, remember, from the year 1982, when I would have been 21, 22, until the year 2008, we had 25 years of growth with minimal inflation and no major recession. There had been a couple of minor recessions along the way, but really 1990 and 2000, the 2 of the most minor recessions since the Second World War. So it looked like we had cracked the economic puzzle. And then comes the Great Recession and all of the misery of that. And suddenly I had to think again about why many of the policies I'd said it was time to reform in the 1970s and 80s, why they'd been put there in the first place. And so that set my brain thinking, and I began writing in somewhat different directions. And then came the Trump turn. And I'd seen that coming. I'd begun to notice in the 2010s, in the wake of the Great Recession, a revival of what I call, not in an insulting way, not in an inflammatory way, not to demean anybody, but in as technical way as I can. In the same way that I would use a term like socialism, the return of fascism. And again, I don't mean this as an insult. I don't mean this to be flamboyant. I just mean that fascism is a body of ideas and practices. And we associate it with the styles and behaviors of the 1930s, but it can, just like socialism can take many forms, so can fascism. And this was back. It was back in Eastern Europe. It was back in South America, and it was rising in Western European countries with far-right parties in Germany, and here it was in the United States. And that began it seemed to me that this kind of politics had an ominous future. And it was the job of all of us who believed, as I did, still do, in a free society, in a free market, in the role of American leadership in the world to stand up against this. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I've been trying to do since Trump coalesced in 2015.